if you are a Republican running for office at the local level or a Republican running for president, and you say some pro-Israel line, there is an 80% chance that your audience is going to agree with you and cheer. And this is important because it's a stark contrast for the Democrats, in which less than 50% support Israel. And so they are thinking if they say something pro-Israel out on the hustings, there's a 50% chance at least that they're going to get booed or criticized for it. So the fact that the Republican electorate is so overwhelmingly pro-Israel at this point, I think is kind of a check on some of the tendencies that some less pro-Israel Republicans might have on being critical of Israel.
Is the Trump administration pro-Israel? Well, there's evidence to support the claim that it is. It's given Israel the armaments and rhetorical support it needs to fight on until total victory in Gaza. It has targeted the Houthis in Yemen. It has a record of taking action, economic, diplomatic, and military, against Iran, and so has a degree of credibility in countering Israel's greatest external threat. The president has put champions of the U.S.-Israel relationship in key roles. The Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of Defense are all on record advocating even closer relations between Washington and Jerusalem. President Trump invited the Israeli Prime Minister for an extensive, private meeting in the Oval Office, the first such meeting of his second term. The Republican convention last year was perhaps the greatest single spectacle of American Zionism aired in prime time. And yet, there are some who see in the Trump administration an equal measure of signs and portents that it will not strengthen, but instead weaken the U.S.-Israel relationship. There is a current of isolationism within the administration and among its key supporters, combined with a strategic concept that weighs American investment in the confrontation with China against American investment in the Middle East. In senior and sub-cabinet appointments, as well as in the Trump coalition's media environment, these voices have a significant presence as well. In addition, there has been a welling up of genuinely anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist passions and enmities from right-wing social media and from Trump-aligned populist figures with large online followings. So what is it? Is the second Trump administration's conception of an America First foreign policy pro-Israel, or isn't it? Well, I think the answer has to be that the administration contains both of these elements, and that it's the president's job to manage the tensions between them. Welcome to the Tikvah Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. The premise of today's conversation is that the tension between those who see Israel as an asset to American interests and those who see Israel as a liability, that tension has been present in every Republican administration since Israel was established in 1948. My guest this week is Tevi Troy, Senior Fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute, Senior Scholar at the Strauss Center at Yeshiva University, and a former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services. Tevi is also a presidential historian. His most recent book is The Power and the Money, the Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. This week, we discuss the enduring tensions over Israel policy within Republican presidential administrations, stretching back to President Nixon. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to the Tikvah Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. I hope you leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my conversation with Tevi Troy. Tevi Troy, welcome back to the Tikvah Podcast.
John, thank you so much for having me on your excellent podcast. I always appreciate the thoughtful people you have on and the thoughtful questions you ask them.
So I think that it is safe to, how does one look at the U.S.-Israel relationship and analyze it politically? And I think that one of the heuristics that, at least to me, has been valuable is that there are some administrations that tend to see Israel as an asset to American power, and there are some administrations that tend to see Israel as a liability for American power. But then when you press that, it seems like that debate is endemic even within administrations, and that there are always some factions within administrations that look at that question in each of those two respective ways. And as we're experiencing some of that level of debate out in the open in the Trump administration, I thought it might make sense to look at the history of the Republican Party and its presidential administrations, its conduct of American foreign policy, and try to pick apart the times in which it has seen Israel as an asset, the times in which it's seen Israel as a limit, as a limitation and vulnerability for the conduct of American foreign policy. And, to me, it makes sense to sort of begin with the Reagan administration, where, President Trump it is much often said that President Trump has remade the Republican Party in his image, which is certainly true. But the Republican Party that he remade, it seems to me, was launched with President Reagan. And so I thought it might make sense to begin there.
I think it's a great framing, and it's definitely worth going to Reagan. And as you know, I love Reagan. I even work at the Ronald Reagan Institute. But I think you have to go a little further back if you want to look at Republicans and Israel, because with Reagan, you have a situation where there's some ambivalence. Some do think Israel is an asset and some think it's a liability. But if you look back in history, there are only three Republican presidents in the era of Israel before Reagan. Those are Eisenhower, Nixon, and Ford. And for the most part, Israel is seen as a liability.
Mm-hmm.
Administrations, especially in the Eisenhower administration, it almost wasn't a question that Israel is this small, outnumbered, beleaguered nation. The Arabs have the oil, the Arabs have the numbers. Why are we wasting our time? And that in the Eisenhower administration, the belief was that there's only interest in Israel because of domestic political interests and not really that they're a benefit to us. In the Nixon administration, Nixon came in thinking that the Johnson and Kennedy administrations had been too pro-Israel, and he's trying to rebalance things away. Again, seeing Israel as a bit of a liability. Now, you do have to give Nixon credit for doing the rearming of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, after the initial first wave of attacks in which Israel did not do so well. But Israel comes in with some skepticism of Israel, which I think is best exemplified by this wonderful story where Henry Kissinger, who is Jewish and national security advisor, first person to have that role as a Jewish person. And at one point, he says something in a meeting that is somewhat pro-Israel. Kissinger wasn't an unabashed pro-Israel person by any means, but he says something pro-Israel in a national security meeting. And Nixon cuttingly says, "Now can we have the American point of view, Henry?" Which really shows what he thought of Kissinger, what he thought of Jews, what he thought of Israel.
Right.
And then the Ford administration also, even less friendly to Israel than Nixon was, and very critical of Israel. And the one bright spot in that administration was Daniel Patrick Moynihan at the UN, who fought a heroic fight against the Zionism is racism resolution and had to engage in all kinds of dirty, underhanded tricks to get the State Department to allow him to do what he was doing. Like they had this primitive type of fax machine, and they would say the fax machine was broken when they had to send the faxes to State Department to get approval. So then Moynihan would run out of time, and then he'd give his pro-Israel speeches on the floor of the UN. So Reagan comes in the context of three administrations that were Republican that were not so pro-Israel, but things.
Wait, let me pause you right there for 1 second.
Made Reagan interesting.
Let me pause you right there, because there is an aspect that I want to draw out of, I think, Nixon and Ford's experience. And I think that Kissinger saw something about this that made him unique and farsighted and would set the table for, certainly through the Reagan administration, which is the role that Israel might play within the geopolitics of the Cold War. And that there's some kind of competition with Russia in particular, with the Soviet Union in particular, in which Israel could really be a force multiplier for American interest. And that, in particular, that Nixon and Kissinger saw that the settlement of the Yom Kippur War had the potential to bring Egypt away from the Soviet camp and into the American camp. And they began to see Israel, maybe not altogether as an asset the way that later evangelical Christian influenced presidents might, but they began to see, in the context of realist foreign policy, Israel as an asset in that way.
Yeah, not only did they see it, but they were right, because their maneuverings after the Yom Kippur War and in the ending, in the peace settlement or the ceasefire around the Yom Kippur War, led to the expulsion of the Soviets, the Russians, from the Middle East for decades. And they were only brought back by Obama unwisely when he had the whole issue with the Syrian chemical attack. So yes, they saw the opportunity and they took advantage of it, and it was in the Cold War context. But Israel also bolsters itself in that very same Cold War context by its victory in the 73 war, a hard-won victory to be sure, and there were many, many tragic losses. But Israel also captures Soviet T-62 tanks that Western intelligence analysts and defense analysts had never before seen.
Hmm.
And suddenly, the Americans are getting a look at Soviet military equipment that had been deployed by the Egyptians and by the Syrians that they had never before seen. And it's an intelligence coup for the Americans. And in fact, those very same planes that are bringing the C-130s that are bringing the arms to Israel are coming back to Washington with captured Soviet weaponry that the CIA and the Defense Department were very, very eager to get their hands on. So again, Israel starts to move away from the liability category and into the possible asset category with the Yom Kippur War because of the arms captures and because of the Kissinger-esque maneuverings that led to the expulsion of the Soviets from the region.
Okay, so now let's try to understand how Israel was seen from within the foreign policy apparatus of the Reagan administration.
So within the Reagan administration, again, there's some of this legacy of, I would say, not pro-Israel views within the Republican Party, but there are also interesting changes taking place, not just among the defense and intelligence establishment that are starting to see the benefits of Israel, but evangelical Christians are starting to be an important part of the Republican movement, the conservative movement, and they are very pro-Israel. And Menachem Begin was an early person to see and recognize this. And he would build ties with moral majority leaders, Christian evangelical leaders. And then also, Reagan was a very pro-freedom guy, and he just generally liked a democracy in a sea of non-free countries that are in the Middle East. So Reagan had a predisposition to like Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that he always sided with Israel, because there were a number of instances in which the Israeli government and the US government had serious tensions in the Reagan administration. I would say most especially on the sale of AWACS, which are a type of reconnaissance plane, to the Saudis in early 80s. And the Reagan administration pushed very hard to get that through Congress, and it was a very contentious fight. Then you also have Israel's bombing of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor, which was a huge coup for Israel and for the world, I would say, but the Reagan administration did condemn it. Now, there's some sense that they half-heartedly condemned it. The State Department called it an act of aggression, but Jeane Kirkpatrick, when she condemned it, she wasn't very excited about it. She was the U.S. ambassador to the UN. But the best way to see the change in the Republican Party is the Reagan administration condemning that Osirak bombing. And then 10 years later, when Dick Cheney is Secretary of Defense in the George H.W. Bush administration, he sends a note to the Israelis praising them for what they had done, because he recognized how important it was if they were going to fight Saddam Hussein and force Iraq out of Kuwait, that Saddam not have nuclear weapons. So there was an even greater recognition that Israel had done a good thing. And then the third big source of tension between the Reagan administration and the Israeli government in the 80s is over the invasion of Lebanon. Reagan is willing to give them a little leeway because of the horrific terrorist attacks that were coming from the PLO out of Lebanon. And, a lot of Palestinians went into Lebanon and destabilized the place and led to the civil war and led to a lot of terrorist attacks coming out of Lebanon. But the images on the nightly news are very devastating to Israel, and they affect Reagan. And Reagan gets into it with Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, a number of times on this issue. And there are, as you say, I guess the premise of the podcast is that there have been disagreements within Republican administrations before. There are disagreements inside the Reagan administration over the Lebanon issue and how to handle Israel's invasion.
So I think it'd be valuable if you can just sort of tell us a little bit about these camps within the administration. You might have, Secretary Haig and Secretary Schultz on this side, and you might have Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, on that side. I'm not sure exactly where you draw the lines and how you divide things, but why don't you just introduce us to some of the people, of course, James Baker, who's playing a role in the Reagan administration. Why don't you just tell us who's around and generally the way that they tend to look at Israel and the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a good question. I remember as a young boy when Alexander Haig left the administration and George Shultz came in. My father, who was very involved in following the Israel issues, he was very concerned because he thought Shultz would not be a pro-Israel figure at the State Department. But in fact, he was. He was very pro-Israel, more so than I guess even Haig was when Haig was Secretary of State. But Caspar Weinberger, as you correctly note, was not a fan of Israel. In fact, he was irate when the Jonathan Pollard spy scandal was uncovered. And, there's reason to be irate over that. But he wanted Pollard executed. And he was completely, he was irate about the whole thing and very unforgiving on the situation. So Weinberger was constantly a critic of Israel. And he really, he does come out of the Nixon administration and has some of those earlier Republican views. But then you also have the neoconservative influences within the Reagan administration. I would say this is especially Jeane Kirkpatrick, who is the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Our old friend and the great leader at Tikvah, Elliot Abrams, is in there as well, although he's not focused on Israel policy, but he is at the State Department in that period. So, there are some pro-Israel voices, there's some skeptical of Israel voices, there's some more neutral voices. So it is a bit of a mix. And I think in that mix comes some of the tension that we see on those multiple fronts, whether it's on Lebanon or OSIRIC or on the or on the Pollard case. So there's multiple sources of tension within the administration.
It's kind of interesting to look back and think. Of course, President Reagan has an enormous legacy when it comes to American foreign policy, maybe his signal legacy, when it comes to the reorientation of the American attitude toward the Soviet Union and the conduct of the Cold War. Nevertheless, I think you'd have to say that that policy is not especially pronounced in the Middle East specifically. And that you could say for us, students of the U.S.-Israel relationship, we're sort of trying to follow that thread through his administration. But from President Reagan's point of view, it didn't seem like a first priority issue.
Well, it wasn't a first priority issue. And in fact, Will Inboden, who writes what I think is the definitive and magisterial history of the Reagan administration's foreign policy, the peacemaker, he says that Reagan was much more successful on the issues that he knew more about and focused on. And those included relationships with Europe and the Cold War, the struggle against the Soviet Union. He was less knowledgeable about the Middle East. He got burned in the Middle East on at least more than one occasion, specifically the Hezbollah bombing of the U.S. Marines that killed 241 Marines in 1983. So Reagan less focused on the Middle East and less effective in the Middle East. And I thought that was an interesting insight from the Inboden book.
So President Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, is next inaugurated as the president of the United States. He comes, of course, himself from the oil industry. It's quite literally a country club Republican. He represents in some ways the pluperfect example of that, harkening back to that old pre-evangelical, pre-philo-Semitic sort of Republican image. How do you see his administration and the conduct of American foreign policy in Israel?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, you described it pretty well right there. That he was from that earlier era, and he was not a big fan of Israel. And his attitude was, again, let's put more pressure on Israel. And it is interesting in this Dennis Ross's book, where he looks at multiple administrations and the relationship on Israel. He says there's this recurring theme that a new administration comes in and says we have to rebalance things against Israel, and that we have to take more of the Arab perspective. And multiple administrations come in wanting to take that approach. And George H.W. Bush is definitely in that camp. And he thinks he can make peace in the Middle East. And the way to do it is by putting pressure on Israel. And look, Israel puts itself in a situation where they are susceptible to pressure, not only because the U.S. is such an important ally, but because there's a lot of assistance that goes from America to Israel. And some smart people have talked about whether Israel should think about weaning itself off that assistance so that America has less of an ability to twist Israel's arm by dangling the assistance in front of them. I think on balance, the assistance is the right thing and a good thing, but there are some interesting arguments that have been taking place in that regard. So Bush has this idea that he wants to put more pressure on Israel, and this comes to a head on the issue of the loan guarantees. Israel needs these loan guarantees to help resettle Soviet refugees from the Soviet Union in Israel because it's a very expensive proposition. A lot of Soviet Jews are leaving Israel, finally able to leave after decades of oppression. And Bush wants to put limits on the loan guarantees and also pressure Israel to go ahead with this peace conference. And when Israel and Israeli lobbyists push back, Bush says this thing like, I'm this one lonely guy against a sea of lobbyists. And there's another kind of nasty statement by James Baker, who was chief of staff in the Reagan years, but is now the Secretary of State under Bush, where he says to Israel, if you're serious about peace, you know the White House number, 202-456-1414. So again, very, very dismissive attitude. And there's a very young diplomat in the Israeli embassy in those days named Benjamin Netanyahu. And he is so, I guess, adamant and effective that both Baker and Bob Gates, who is a senior national security aide, want to ban him from the White House. They don't want him coming in and lobbying because they find him, I guess, annoying or too effective, maybe both. So there's definitely some tension there. And we see the tension within the administration when that famous leak comes from what James Baker said in a private meeting in the White House, where he said something along the lines of, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway. And this line is overheard by Jack Kemp, who leaks it to Mayor Ed Koch, who's now former mayor, but a columnist for the Daily News, who runs it in his Daily News column, where it makes a little bit of noise, but not a huge splash. But then it is run again in the New York Times. There's an article about this whole conflagration, and then it becomes a huge, huge story. So, and there is one story that Kemp and Baker almost came to blows over their disagreements on Israel. Now, I should point out that Kemp, huge fan of Israel, was an important person in trying to make Israel and the GOP closer, make the GOP a more pro-Israel party. But Kemp, it should be noted, was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Bush administration and did not have a senior foreign policy role. So I think that is an interesting factor here as well. But there are other actors within the Bush administration who are seen as more pro-Israel, specifically Dan Quayle, who is a more pro-Israel voice internally. And he also is instrumental in helping to move the administration forward towards getting the UN to get rid of the Zionism is racism resolution. That was the one that Moynihan had unsuccessfully fought against 15 or 17 years earlier.
You could actually widen the aperture a bit and take into your angle of vision the fact that at the moment that the presidential administration is led by somebody who has somewhat, out of date, from the Republican point of view at least, out of date, cool attitude toward Israel, congressional Republicans at this time start to be extremely warm toward Israel. And that must have exerted an enormous amount of pressure on the administration's Israel policy.
It is true that congressional Republicans at this point were becoming more pro-Israel. I don't think it was fully recognized the degree to which the congressional Republicans were pro-Israel. That doesn't really happen until 94 when Newt Gingrich takes over the Congress, and this is in the administration of Bill Clinton. And then at this point, the House GOP is seen as a fully pro-Republican, pro-Israel, pro-Republican, Republican pro-Israel party. And because there's no administration, there's no real tension between one element of the party being less pro-Israel and one being more pro-Israel. It's just the pro-Israel Congress, GOP Congress is regnant at the time. So, but yes, you are right that there are more pro-Israel elements within the Republican caucus in both the House and the Senate, including some people who were turned around on the issue. Someone like Jesse Helms, who comes in from North Carolina in the 70s as I would say, an anti-Israel Democrat, or certainly a skeptical of Israel Democrat. And then he is turned around in part by the famous APAC trips that take him to Israel. So he sees what the situation is really like on the ground. And there's one other thing that's happening in the 90s that's important, which is Israel, which had been a socialist economy for so long, is starting to move in a different direction. This is especially when this formerly young diplomat Netanyahu becomes finance minister first prime minister, then becomes finance minister in Israel, and pushes forward these pro-free market reforms that help turn Israel away from its socialism. And Rudy Boschwitz, who is a pro-Israel Republican Jewish senator from Minnesota, told me that his colleagues among the Republicans in the Senate would say to him, "Your people are so smart at business. Why do they have a socialist country?" And once they moved away from that socialism, it opened the GOP up even more to being willing to support Israel.
When you sort of think about George H.W. Bush's main preoccupations in the Middle East, I think you have to think about the war that America fought there in the Persian Gulf. Um, a war in which Saddam Hussein consciously decided to attack Israel and sought to draw Israel into the conflict, and which, as far as I can reconstruct the historical record, it seems like the American administration spent an enormous amount of effort to keep Israel out of the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. They were constantly pressuring Israel not to get involved. And, Israel has very strict rules about reprisals. If you hit us, we're going to hit you back. And it was contrary to everything that Israeli governments had believed since the founding of the state to sit on their hands when Scud missiles land in Israel. And these Scud missiles come from Iraq, and the Americans are putting enormous pressure on the Israelis not to push back and not to send their own teams, and they had teams ready to go on the ground to try and take out these Scud missiles. But Bush and his team recognized that if Israel got involved in the conflict, some of the allies that Bush had put together in the coalition against Hussein's invasion of Kuwait would bail, and they would no longer be part of anything that had anything to do with Israel. It's actually a stark contrast to what we saw in the last year when Iran fires these missiles at Israel, and America and Israel and some European nations and Jordan help to knock down some of these missiles. So, things have changed and let me give a positive perspective for the listeners here in Tikvah who, no offense, don't always hear positivity coming from everyone who you interview, that look, things can change for the better. I mean, to think that Arab countries would participate in an action to defend Israel from outside missile attacks is something that was unimaginable in the past.
In a way, the agreement with Jordan, which took place formally in 1994 during the Clinton administration, I think there's an argument that can be made that that is the flowering of seeds that were planted before, in fact, in the George H.W. Bush administration at the Madrid Peace Conference. Maybe you can just tell us a word about that, what that was all about.
Well, I mean, it's with mixed emotions because the Madrid peace conference, the Israelis were not big fans of it because they feel like these international peace conferences are kind of set against them, that they're going to be ganged up on, and that's why they prefer. And they've been successful with, for the most part, more direct negotiations or negotiations with just the Americans as a partner, rather than these international peace conferences where everybody feels obliged to get up and denounce Israel. But the Madrid press conferences were the big initiative within the George H.W. Bush administration to try and come to some peace agreement. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but there were a lot of early steps towards recognition. I guess, people being in the same room or being, within eyesight of each other. And so these are very early thaws in the relationships that, as you correctly said, led to the flowering of things like the Jordan relationship down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to put yourself back in the mindset of what was happening at the time, Israel led by Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, and very resistant to sitting with to sitting at a big summit gathering of that kind. I think one can say in retrospect that the big achievement of Madrid was simply that it happened, and that exactly as you say, Tevi, all these people sat around a table together, and that sort of hadn't happened before in the light of the public and with cameras rolling. But not a lot of consequence came out of it, except I think one can say that years later, um, some of the conversations that began there did lead, I would say, to the Jordan Peace Initiative.
Yeah,
Well,
look, you got to start somewhere. And as Churchill famously said, jaw is better than war. So starting the conversations can sometimes lead to a better result, even if it doesn't happen immediately.
so by the time we come to the next Republican administration, the administration of George W. Bush, here, my own memory, at least, my own historical memory is keener. And I remember just very tense disagreements between factions of the Bush administration when it came to Israel in general, settlements, and the war in Lebanon. But why don't you set up the dramatis personae and tell us how you analyze the disagreement over Israel in that administration?
Well, of course, you have to remember that the most important person in that administration is George W. Bush. And George W. Bush, even though he's the son of George H.W. Bush, is a different kind of Republican from a different kind of Republican Party. I have a friend you probably know who wears a kippah and was at an event with George W. Bush when he was running for president. And he saw my friend with the kippah and he went straight up to him and he said, I want you to know that I'm going to be different than my father was on Israel. And I think the emblematic statement of George W. Bush is in the horrors of the Second Intifada, the bombing Intifada, when Israeli buses were being bombed by these suicide bombers and over 1,000 Israelis were killed. It was really quite horrific. The State Department wants the press secretary, Ari Fleischer, who is Jewish, to put out some kind of statement along the lines of, well, we condemn violence on all sides. And Bush sees the statement because Fleischer brings it to him beforehand. And Bush says, we're not going to say that. Why don't we say Israel has a right to defend itself? And that was really, really a watershed moment. That was Bush saying from the very top of the administration, we are going to back Israel. And there was a real palpable sense after 9/11 when we in the US were subjected to a horrific, tragic terrorist attack by Islamist terrorists who want to destroy Israel as much as they want to destroy America, that we're in the same boat. And I think Bush recognized that. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in the Bush administration was as pro-Israel. I mean, I think on the more pro-Israel side, you certainly had Elliott Abrams, who is now back in a more directly related to Israel role. You have Dick Cheney and his top aide, Scooter Libby. You have some of the folks at the Defense Department, including Douglas Feith and Don Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, who are more in the pro-Israel camp. And then you have some of the more Israel skeptics, as usual, at the State Department in the form of Colin Powell and Dick Armitage. So there's tension within the administration, but the thumb on the scale, I would say, is George W. Bush, and he is much more pro-Israel than his Republican presidential predecessors.
How do you think the 9/11 attacks changed the Bush administration's posture toward Israel?
Well, I think the first thing you have to say is that the 9/11 attacks changed the Bush administration's posture towards the world. Bush famously came in saying that he wasn't going to be doing foreign policy adventurism. He was going to be focused on rebuilding us domestically. And then suddenly 9/11 happens and it's a completely foreign policy / national security administration. And then within that context, you also have to remember that Israel is being attacked by people of the same ideology that are attacking America. And so there's a sense that of shared struggle that we're in it together. And I'm really amazed as someone who lived through 9/11 and lived through October 7th, just to see how different America is in terms of the media and the college campuses and the culture itself, Hollywood, how the some of this rot that is taking place within the cultural elites has led to an unwillingness to defend Israel, the West, or America at all, and to almost feel like the people who are attacking us and trying to tear down as a Western civilization are the good guys rather than the bad guys. So I think you have to look at it in that context. I think for the most part, Americans were looking at these horrific attacks, and it didn't matter if you were Democrat or Republican, everyone was saying, this is bad, we condemn it, we've got to push back against it. And most people, even if not all, at the time were saying that Israel is our ally. And I often like to talk about the two trends in foreign policy, and specifically related to Israel, that the Republican Party has started low and has been moving high in terms of supporting Israel, and the Democrats started high and have been moving low, and that the X point, the intersection between the two parties both being pro-Israel, really took place in that decade from 94 to 2004 or so, where both parties were generally pro-Israel and could be counted on to be pro-Israel. And since then, the Democrats have continued against Israel. And the Republicans, while they were ascendant, and at one point I would have said one of the few things that connects all Republicans is being supportive of Israel, and I've written that publicly, it seems to be like there's some fraying at the edges of that as well. And it's no longer a guarantee, a lock, that if you say someone's Republican, that you can count on them being pro-Israel.
On the other hand, I think one has to say that that's true. I do want to come to that and ask your opinion about it, but I am struck. I mean, we have not yet spoken about the first Trump administration, which I do want to come to. But just skipping ahead, in a way out of order, I was struck, especially at the Republican Party nomination this year, that it was the most public, overt expression of American Zionism that one can recall. Um, Obviously, this is an environment after October 7th in which there are not only Israeli but also American hostages that are bound in Gaza. Nevertheless, it was so overt and so ubiquitous at the Republican nomination, the Republican convention. Um, it was surprising, and it was surprising, and um, it has been expressed within the Trump administration, at least in part of it. And so, maybe we can talk about both the first and second Trump administrations and the endemic tension, as we've seen in previous Republican administrations, so we see in this one too, that there's disagreement, and that, like President Reagan and like President George W. Bush, President Trump too has this debate happening within his administration and sees his role as managing the debate.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I would say that the first Trump administration is in some ways like the Eisenhower administration. It had the least disagreement on Israel. Now, the Eisenhower administration being critical of Israel, and the first Trump administration had little disagreement being pro-Israel. So it was different, but they were, I think there were fewer fights on Israel within the Trump administration than in any of these other administrations I've described. I'm not sure that will continue to be true for the second Trump administration because there are some different perspectives out there. But I do have to say, even though I said there's some fraying, you can assume for the most part that most Republicans are pro-Israel, most Republican voters are pro-Israel. The Republican Party remains a pro-Israel party, but there are some indications that there are some people within the conservative coalition. I don't even want to call it conservative coalition, the right-wing coalition, maybe, that that are increasingly critical of Israel. These tend to be people from the more isolationist wing, and I think it's something that we're going to have to be watching for and vigilant over to try and make sure that we can keep the Republican Party a pro-Israel party in the years ahead.
When I listen to these voices, now I'm gonna for the sake of ease for our conversation, I'm gonna call them the Tucker Carlson wing of the party. It's a very complex and much and considerably wider network of voices than just him, but as a kind of representative figure. What's interesting to me about that, Tevi, is that I read their basic posture toward the projection of American power in the world, and the role of Israel in particular, as a reaction to a previous Republican administration policy, namely the conduct of the global war on terror and the American war in Iraq. And their read that was such an over-leveraged, overwrought waste of an unstrategic and foolish and a waste of American blood and treasure. And their reaction to a previous Republican administration, in a way, this remains intra-Republican kind of critique and debate.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I would also urge your listeners to read Eli Lake's great work on looking at the Iraq War 20 years later. And I think there are some very good arguments to be had there. But I do think that the people who are critical of Israel within this establishment, who are understandably critical of the Iraq War, I think they blame Israel too much for what happened there, because I don't think it was an Israel-led initiative that led to that idea of overthrowing Saddam Hussein. I mean, it was, America didn't consider doing it in the first Gulf War. It was only after 9/11 when we felt much more vulnerable to whatever weapons Saddam Hussein might be developing, that we thought certainly people like Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby, senior people within the Republican administration, and Cheney, I should add, is not Jewish. It was people like that who were saying that we need to do something about the threat from Saddam Hussein, but it was not because of Saddam Hussein's threats to Israel. It was because of Saddam Hussein's potential threat to the United States. So I think Israel gets a little unfairly blamed in this back and forth about the Iraq War.
I mean, not that the facts matter. I mean, the facts matter. The facts matter to honest men, but in the highly partisan, highly politicized discourse. But as I recall, there are major aspects of the Israeli security establishment opposed the way that the Americans conceptualized the Iraq War and criticized its war aims and the far-reaching broad nature of ideological nature of those aims and the democracy promotion agenda. I tend to think that when America projects power in the world, it tends to favor Israel as a general matter. But as I recall, Israel was considerably more skeptical about the aims of the conduct of the global war on terror than is now sometimes remembered by its critics.
That is true, and Israel is also skeptical of the this democracy push. Condi Rice, who was the national security advisor, was pushing for elections among the Palestinians, specifically on the Gaza question, and Israel was warning that Hamas is going to win these elections. And so what happened was Hamas did obviously take over in Gaza, and in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas won one election, and he's in the 20th year of a 4-year term. So they recognize as well that elections would not necessarily lead to pro-freedom results, even if you could call them small d democratic.
So when you widen out and look at the Republican electorate and the way that it has changed as it's come to look at Israel, certain aspects of the Republican electorate have grown even warmer and have deepened their affection for Israel, and therefore favored the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship. We now see that there are certainly pockets of the Republican electorate that do not feel that way. How do you think that that's likely to translate into presidential priorities?
Yeah, well, I often look at these polls of where the American people are on Israel, and remember, the majority of people are still with Israel. And when I say people, I mean all Americans.
Yeah.
And then if you look at Republicans, it's more pro-Israel, so much so that it's something like 80% of Republican voters, so the Republican electorate, says they are supportive of Israel, which means that if you are a Republican running for office at the local level or a Republican running for president, and you say some pro-Israel line, there is an 80% chance that your audience is going to agree with you and cheer. And this is important because it's a stark contrast with the Democrats, in which less than 50% support Israel. And so they are thinking if they say something pro-Israel out on the hustings, there's a 50% chance at least that they're going to get booed or criticized for it. So the fact that the Republican electorate is so overwhelmingly pro-Israel at this point, I think is kind of a check on some of the tendencies that some less pro-Israel Republicans might have on being critical of Israel. And look, if you see the votes in Congress, there's really only one member who regularly votes against Israel on the Republican side. That's Thomas Massie of Kentucky. And Trump has said he wants to primary the guy and get rid of him. And I think for a variety of reasons that would be a good thing. So again, the politics of it for a Republican member, I think, lead towards being pro-Israel. Now, there are some people in the commentariat, I wouldn't call them intellectuals, but in the commentariat, who are much more critical of Israel. And you correctly note that it's the Tucker Carlson contingent. And those people, when you have people in the commentariat making a point over and over again, at some point it has an impact on the electorate. And so it's why I am nervous going forward. But at this point, I look at the Republican electorate and see that as a bulwark against the Republican Party moving in a more critical direction of Israel.
Well, in this conversation, we have focused on the enduring tensions within Republican administrations. But for people who want to learn more about the subject in general, I do recommend something that Tevi wrote back in December of 2015. This is a major essay and commentary called How the GOP Went Zionist. Tevi Troy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, as always, on the Tikvah Podcast.